Welcome everyone to another episode of 5-Year Finance, which is a webinar that we've been putting on regularly to discuss where various different sort of thought leaders, experts are thinking about where the world is heading, what's going on, and it gives me great pleasure to bring Chad Cooper, who's a great sort of coach and thinker who's had an extraordinarily varied career. You've been a Marine, you've been in Microsoft, you've then sort of, seems like you had a sort of deep realization that we can dig into in a bit, and sort of decided to reposition what you were doing to becoming a high performance coach, and have worked with many of the sort of top leaders in everything from sort of motivational work to top sports people to top business people and everything in between. And so I thought it'd be really, really interesting. I think a lot of people are sort of thinking, where should we go? How do I perform in this current environment? I mean, entire industries have gone from obscenely profitable to massively loss-making almost overnight, and yet others are repositioning at sort of a matter of knots. And I think the key for everyone is, I think it's sort of in their power to figure out where the world will be 5 years from now, how you reposition it, and kind of, I guess from that, Chad, sort of where do you think how do you think people should be thinking about the current moment, and how can they get the best out of themselves?
Well, thank you. I appreciate the kind words in that, Toby. And what I would really look at is, right now you kind of have people in two separate camps. And in the finance world, we might want to separate those people from those that have discretionary income and those that don't, right? Those are going to really kind of determine, you would think initially, who's in survival versus who has stability. But what I would actually rather look at is with the kind of clients that I attract and that I have the opportunity to work with. So I've worked with all the way up from billionaires to, I specialize with professional athletes, specifically athletes that are transitioning their careers, either entering in or exiting out, and looking for that smooth transition. Right now, we're in a transition. And so we've had a lot of uncertainties that are going on. And so the basic fundamental question that we really want to start with is, in a pyramid, where are we within that? So Maslow, people know from psychology, in the basic human needs, right? Food, shelter, and reproduction, as an example. He also came up with that in a way that is the 4 S's, and it's survival, stability, success, significance. And so we need to be realistic to assess, where are we? And often, after 9/11, we got into this, profiling's bad. No, profiling's good when it's done ethically. And we need to do some profiling, right? We need to profile who are these so-called leaders, and what are the leadership traits that they're actually able to display right now. So we have to assess for ourselves, am I in survival or am I in stability right now? How much padding do I have? And then we need to assess that for the landscape, the environment that we're in. But those 2 quadrants that I was talking about, Toby, is really the people who are in a position of living in effect. And they're saying, I'm in the situation I'm in. They're freaking out. They're uncertain. They don't have savings. They don't know how they're going to survive. And they're looking at and blaming the environment or other people. It's not my fault. I'm a victim. And I totally get that. But you have a choice in which camp you want to be in. And are you in the camp of living in the fact? Are you in the camp of being able to say this is an excuse? Or in the smaller percentage, are you in the camp of it's an explanation? Look, what happened sucked, right? But it's not an excuse for what decisions I make going forward. I'm taking ownership. I'm going to take responsibility. And if we're able to do that, that's a great place to be looking at from survival. Because to be in survival, Toby, we have to generate. We can't sit and wait or we die, right? We have a lot of evidence of species that sat and waited only to die. So regardless of where we're at, if we're in survival, we don't want to be in effect. We want to generate and say, but what can I do about it?
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting, you bringing it back to Maslow and how, I think what will be going on right now is a lot of people who probably never needed to worry about covering sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs are suddenly going, geez, the money in my bank is going down, 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 and they don't necessarily have an income. I know very successful friends who have found themselves in that situation who were at the top of their game 2 months ago, and it's kind of a and I find that really, really interesting. And obviously a lot of us have lived through these kind of times with 2008 where it was similar but probably in a less drastic level, and it's kind of how do you go about sort of thinking about the forces, like what do you see in a top performer where they get the nuggets that they sort of need to lean into to
Yeah, so I've had the pleasure, and I continue to work with world champion athletes. I've got 11-time world champion boxer. I have multi-gold medal winning Olympians. And the thing that they actually have more in common with, so if we looked at this from a financial aspect, I'm actually more concerned about the person that is making 6 figures, but is living as if they're making 6.5 figures, than the person who's already in poverty and they have a setback. And why? Because this person's in comfort. This person is over leveraged. And so when the poop hits the fan, as we would say in the States, they freak out, right? They were at success. But the problem with that is they have no stability. That's the layer between success and survival. The person who's in survival has to generate. So the thing with that person, the thing that they have in common with professional athletes, the thing they have in common with war heroes, with Olympians, is they've learned how to be resourceful. They learn how to adapt. And so what we want to do with that is to say, regardless of where you're at on that spectrum, is to say, okay, what am I going to do about it? So former United States President John F. Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And so that brings us back to those camps. You have somebody that's making, 6.5 figures. So let's say 150,000 pounds a year. And somebody might go, oh my gosh, that's a lot. Somebody else is like, it's not worth getting out of bed for 150,000 pounds a year. But that puts you in a place where you could have some discretionary income. If that person's sitting back saying, what's the government? What's my employer? What's somebody going to do for me? That's a really scary place to be. I'd rather look at the person who is looking, going, I want to get there, and knows how to be resourceful. And so when that happens, we need to take a look at it and say, we're not going back, Toby. The world has changed. Change is inevitable. Growth, however, is optional. So do we want to grow? And there's 4 things that we can look at when we make that commitment to say, what can I do for my country? What can I do for myself? What can I do for my business, for my family? Because that shifts you from being an effect to moving into cause. And that's the kind of people that I work with, and that's what separates them, is that's really only about 3% of the population. That's it for the world. 3%. 97% of the world lives in the effect of other people's decisions. And so if we're living, that's the vast majority, then we have to look at who are these so-called leaders. Because now that the poops hit the fan, how many of them are really showing up? How many of them are going, let's generate some options? So it's one thing to, hey, I have a problem, complain and go into your manager's office or go to somewhere. It's another to come and say, you know what, I see a problem and here's what I suggest, or here's some solutions that I would offer to overcome those. That's where we need to move, is don't just complain, offer what do you see to be able to move forward with it. That's what it's going to require. So it's going to be incumbent more than just us, is about us to be able to say what level of collaboration are we willing to engage in.
And yeah, really interesting. So I guess from our perspective at Novum Insights, we're basically providing research and data to people to be able to sort of, in theory, see these trends while they're happening. In many ways, I mean, one of the great tragedies of coronavirus is it was very, very predictable. I mean, epidemiologists have been like screaming from the rooftops for years.
Bill Gates did a TED Talk in 2015 on this subject, pleading for the world to pay attention.
Yeah.
But you know, here's the thing that's interesting about that is it when somebody says, "Hey, I want to hire you as a coach," what many may not realize is I'm interviewing you as much as you're interviewing me, because what I want to see is there leverage? See, Bill had no leverage. The scariest place to be is when you're comfortable. People aren't growing, people aren't learning, people aren't paying attention when they're comfortable, right? It's like, okay, what's your favorite food? Well, if I gave that to you breakfast, dinner, and lunch, and then I said, hey, do you want this for dessert? You're like, no, man, I'm good. Why? There's no leverage. You just got satiated on it. So he was talking to an audience that is fat and happy. We're like, don't care. I'm good now. I mean, after all, we have Amazon Prime. We can get it in an hour. Why should we have to put any effort in?
Fair enough, fair enough. But the great thing is then something happens, and the positive thing from the crisis is almost the human spirit is very, very good at responding to things that they realize are a problem once they've realized it's such a bad problem that they have no choice but to respond. Right? So.
Yeah, and so what we want to do once we realize that we need to respond, and I love that you use the word respond versus react, right? Is we have a choice, and what we want to do is get resourceful and say, throw out all the options, let's go through what are the pros and cons so that we can appropriately respond and stand behind those decisions. And what you're actually doing is, if we're looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs again, is in survival, people may have been in success, Toby, or at least they thought they were in success, and they dropped down to survival. And people then typically are like, oh, I'm in survival, I want to get back to success. Well, great. Your end goal, end game can still be success or significance. But your behavior and the actions you take need to be towards stability. So if you have survival, stability, success, that may be our goal up here, but our actions need to be to create stability. And if you look at what is going on in the world, it isn't to get back to success. The countries that are doing the best is first about stabilizing. If you look at this in an ER, you look at this in many examples, the first protocol is stability. Let's stabilize the patient. And so we often are like, no, we just want success. We want to get back there. But it's not sustainable without stability, or we'll just continue to roller coaster and roller coaster. And so now we're already seeing, and you want to pay attention to the companies. Amazon was a great example. I think it was last week or the week before that they came out with their quarterly earnings of $4 billion in the last quarter. And Jeff Bezos said, wait a minute, I know shareholders, you're not going to like this, but we're not going to distribute it. We're reinvesting it to upgrade our health and our standards within our company. All $4 billion is going back in to raise the stability, because they see, whether it comes or not, we have to have stability, or we're going to continue to do this, and we're going to flatline eventually. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So for anybody that's doing it, you've got to be going for stability right now. Then once you have that, go for success.
Yeah, fantastic. And what I'd be interested to pick your brains on how, so we're essentially looking at a lot of sort of venture-backed startups, innovation, tracking, like all these companies that kind of grew fat in the way you were describing in some ways, because raising money 2-3 years ago, especially if you're in Silicon Valley, I mean, it's still a hard task, but it was relatively capital unconstrained, right? We were in the era
Yeah.
of WeWork and all of sort of a slight bubble in some ways for capital raising, and or a big bubble if you see it in a different way. But I think the interesting thing now is kind of every single one of the projections that these people have been working to have kind of gone out the window, and every business leader is experiencing this in different ways, from Amazon to whoever. How do you go about going, suddenly you think you've got 12, 20 months in the tank before you even need to capital raise, suddenly going, it's possible I only have 3 months in the tank because possibly no one is going to pay me. And what do you sort of say to someone like that, having that sort of realization? How do they respond? Because it's already a fairly high pressure cooker environment.
Yeah, so there's some examples that are out there, and we can look at examples. Amazon was a loss leader. Uber's still a loss leader for an extended period of time. And so what that is really about is how are they positioning, how are they marketing to their investors of, this is a marathon, this isn't a sprint. And so it's incumbent for us, Toby, to be able to really understand what is being offered and what are we positioning. So the companies that we're looking at investing with, are we going in expecting a sprint and expecting quick, return on that investment? Or do we need to change the conversation and say, hey, this is about doing an ultra marathon, okay? We need a lot longer runway than what we had, because here's what it's going to take for us to build this out correctly. And so you want to be able to see, are the people at the helm, the people at the board and leading those companies, having accurate representations of conversations that need to happen. They might be uncomfortable, but that requires them to be able to say, do we have the knowledge, and can we project, can we forecast where things are going and what capital we will need in order to succeed that? And so we can use models of that going to Mars, right? We've now got that back on the plate for the United States, and the president says, hey, we're going to Mars, I want to say by 2025. So like 5 years from now, they want to be able to start launching for that. And so you have to look at, okay, here's the destination, and let's reverse engineer it. Those are the companies that I would be betting on. People that know what the destination is clearly, and know how to work that backwards to see what are the resources, what's the capital, what's the fuel, what do we need in order to actually make that journey successful? What happens if we have these, veer off course? I'm less inclined to go for the companies that are like the cigarette boat, it's like the speedboat, we're just going to blaze our way through. Yeah, maybe some of those do that, but the vast majority don't, right? It's expensive, it's unrealistic, and rarely do they get there without capsizing. So I'm looking for the one that is about the sailboat, saying, hey, we have the course, but we tack and we go zigzag, and we know that we're still on course. But what we're doing is we're harnessing the energy of the wind and using that leverage to propel us. So they bring those expectations and unknowns into their formulas to be able to adapt. Those are the companies that I'd be betting on. And SoftBank is a really interesting one because that dude's all in, right? So will he win? Will he lose? WeWork, I think a hidden piece with WeWork that would turn things around for them, because what's going on with WeWork? Well, people aren't going into the office. Will they go back to the office? It's a huge opportunity for them to leverage and say, get rid of your brick and mortar, and we'll just lease out our space and bring your people in occasionally. But what they'll need to do is bring in a level of AI to be able to assure the confidence that it's a healthy and safe environment, that people can actually get work done, and that they have access to the resources they need. And artificial intelligence can actually help them do that. But that comes down to marketing.
Yeah, no, and it's so fascinating. At Novum ourselves, we've been dealing with a really interesting platform that was put together by likes of IBM, Oracle, and it's tracking any data related to COVID-19, and the research effort there. And it's so fascinating. Like the tech guy there, who was actually one of the architects of Hyperledger Fabric, which is like one of the blockchain programs, he was working on that. And he began just going, he literally flipped his program overnight and made it a big data repository for academic stuff, data on mortality, data on where the contact tracing was, who had the disease, and made it a big open source initiative. And we're now we're getting involved on that on the intellectual property side and feeding in data there. And it's what's incredible to me was almost like overnight, I had probably about 10 of my friends who were working on some kind of COVID style solution, some app, some selling ventilators, whatever, right? It was kind of extraordinary. And I think you will see those tech advances just because there's so much money being poured into this.
So that's what I'm looking for, right? That's the horse that I'm going to bet on, because what I see there is their ability to get out of the blueprint, and they can take a step back like a chef and go, okay, we got all these ingredients. Oh, let's see, we could make a frittata, we could make an omelet, we could make eggs Benedict, instead of somebody who's like, okay, we've got these resources and I only know how to make quiche. Like, dude, you got the ingredients, what? Quiche, that's all. Nobody wants quiche. That's all that we sell is quiche, right? That's the company I'm scared of. I want the one that can go, okay, what can we do with this? They can adapt. They can innovate, because on the other side of this, we're sitting here going, oh my gosh, when are we going to open up? But on the other side of this, oh my gosh, right now, the entertainment industry is like the one that I'm really going, how are they going to pull this off? How are they going to come out of this? Because even if the prime minister says, look, everybody can go back to watch a football match, how many people are actually going to want to? How many people are going to show up? So how many people are going to go to a concert? Events have completely changed. And so the ones that are the winners, is that going to be Ticketmaster that learns how to adapt? Or is that going to be, like a YouTube or Hulu that says, you remember the speakeasies back in the early 1900s? Guess what? Remember the Playboy after hours show that was there? You're too young. You don't remember any of that. And I'm not condoning it, okay? Jeez, lighten up, people. But people want an experience. That's why they go to an event. So the question is okay, what are the ingredients that allow somebody to do the experience? Entertainment industry, I want to know who's going to win that. Who knows how to actually do that from a Netflix or from a Hulu or from a YouTube that's like, look, we are only selling exclusively 1,000 tickets online to watch, I don't know who, Bruno Mars perform in a very intimate setting. So grab your scotch. It's sponsored by Dalmore Scotch today and this foundation, and come on in with your leather recliner, your smoking jacket, and let's just take it in. That's where I see that industry going, right? Somebody's going to win. That's the thinking that I'm looking for, is who's coming up with that versus how do we open up the stadium again?
Yeah, no, totally. And I think this was actually, literally overnight, I was thinking, we're a relatively small company, and thinking, how do we engage with customers? How do you begin? The reason why we created this webinar series was basically, well, look, the world's going to change, so I kind of want to figure out for myself even what's going to happen. So I'm going to ask lots of smart people. It's a nice way to have a dialogue. But then at the same time, I also thought, clearly, it was clear within days that Zoom was going to be a winner from this whole thing, right? In your Hulu, actually, in some ways, Zoom.
Jury's still not out on Zoom.
Well, the dominant web platform. If Zoom is the Amazon of video, maybe they get taken out by someone else. But they've clearly sort of.
The Achilles heel with Zoom right now. Two things. A lot of people don't realize that Zoom is owned by a Chinese entrepreneur. So now we got trust issues. The second, what got exposed, and now Congress in the United States is looking into how secure is this platform? Has this actually been a platform that all the information is being siphoned and then being sent to China? And now all your intellectual property is being violated, right? So Zoom, I haven't rendered that they're the clear winner at this point. I'll tell you who is cleaning house and does it quietly, but has terrible marketing. Microsoft. Microsoft Teams is amazing.
Yeah.
Zoom is an exposure, and that's that their encryption is flawed, right? And they're, oh, we're going to fix it real quick. Damage may be too late. We'll see. Are they going to do okay? Yeah, I think that they'll continue to do well. Will they be able to maintain the market share? I don't know. Look what Microsoft Teams already done to Slack. Microsoft Teams is a powerhouse, and Microsoft is a huge titan.
Yeah, when you got the B2B market, and it's been really interesting watching how that company has been turned around, right? Because in the end of the Bulmer era to the Satcher era, like basically Satcher kind of completely doubled down on cloud and this whole thing. But I'd say Microsoft was behind for a bit in some of that transition, right?
Well, I think that they all do. They all have their cycles, right? And we can see Apple, I would say right now is going through that downward cycle right now, and they're not innovating. They're trying to be a fast follower, but it's kind of like fast, so what, right? But there was a huge change that happened. Ballmer should have never been at the helm. Brilliant guy. I retired under Ballmer's leadership, and that guy maybe has met you once, or maybe you didn't see him for 10 years. And he's like, hey, Chad, how's the, and then he remembered everything. Amazing mind, not the leader, right? Satya Nadella was actually raised and handpicked and went through the schooling. So I think he went to, in Illinois to, was he Northwestern or University of Chicago? It doesn't matter. But what's interesting about that is he actually came through the ranks of Microsoft in the cloud platform. So he knew where the future was going and brought that vision in. That guy is amazingly talented and absolutely one of the best at the helm. By the way, he was also college friends with the CEO of Adobe. How's Adobe doing? Cleaning house, right? So when you have that network, and that's one of the things that you want to take a look at is dig a little bit deeper, is who knows who, and how are they playing those relationships to form partnerships so that they can collaborate. What's Apple doing? They're back to the same old. It's proprietary. We're not letting you in, and I think that they're suffering because of that at this point.
Yeah, and very interesting. And in terms of the Q&A, at any stage, we're more than happy to answer any questions
for it, man.
you might have.
Yeah.
So the audience, but I'm going to keep on firing away. So I think this actually brought quite an interesting question of like, how did you get here to sort of getting to be the coach? Like, what was the journey? Obviously, you've touched on Microsoft. What was the experience like there and from before and overall?
Yeah, I think that started very early. I grew up in a large family. One side of the family, so a separate family, and one side of the family was all girls. The other side was all boys. And so I actually got to get really a nice exposure. And I learned early on, Toby, of when people, I would hear them say, oh, you're the product and the victim of divorced parents. I'm like, what are you talking about, victim or product of? I've got 4 parents that I get to choose all the best qualities and discard what I don't want. You only got 2, right? And so I didn't look at life, I didn't see things as being a victim or the downside or what are the negatives. I learned early on, so you got a broken arm. Are we going to talk about how it got broken, or are we going to go about what we need to do to fix it? And I think that got really reinforced when I went into the Marine Corps, because I went in a bit of a mama's boy, and I came out a macho, capable man. I wouldn't say an evolved present man. Okay, that's not what we're in the business of. But what it allowed me to do, there was a distinctive moment when I was in boot camp and I had the flu, it was coming out both ends, really bad. And my drill instructors had a really empathetic way of helping me through that. They said, drop and start doing push-ups. Now imagine it's coming out both ends and you've got to sit here and do physical training, right? Push-ups. Now a healthy person could probably do push-ups for maybe 3-5 minutes before they're exhausted. I did push-ups for 45 minutes. That's the kind of physical condition I was in when I was sick. And so early on, what I learned is that when we go and start doing something, right now we're doing something, you start working out and the body goes, ooh, Toby, this is painful, stop. But we are capable of 20 times more than what our mind wants to tell us. Our mind is lying to us. And so we have to push beyond pain. And what I learned is I was a major sponsored Ironman triathlete. I had 33 major sponsors. I was offered a tryout on the US ski team, but I went into the Marine Corps instead. I've done numerous things where what I understood was pain is a lever. Pain is useful fuel. Now, it's not going to get you through the endurance, but it is kind of like an electrolyte. And so I stopped looking at and being told that pain is something that we need to avoid. And I looked at it and said, how is it something I can leverage and not be afraid of? Because it's an important ingredient. It's kind of like the sugar in the cookie, right? Too much and not so good. Not at all, doesn't taste so great, right? So I learned to look at things differently. And that allowed me to also be able to go into Microsoft and retire at the age of 35, be able to create my own practice. I've been an elected official for 10 years. And that also allowed me to be able to stand in front of others and have enough self-confidence to be able to say, let me time out, let me understand what you're saying before I cast judgment, and then be able to say, okay, so you're asking for XYZ. Yeah, here's why I can't do that. And I could explain that versus, well, let me look into that, which is really just a polite way of saying not a chance in hell, right? So there are a couple of principles, and what I did is I looked at what Hollywood and what others were saying run away from, and I ran towards it. So I learned how to actually harness it and make it my asset rather than being a slave to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense, and it's yeah, no, so it's interesting. And so and what was it like being in Microsoft? I mean, you were relatively early days there. I mean, no.
Yeah, I was there in the party phase. I was there where money was no object. You don't even want to know what the bar bills I mean, Fridays we had margarita machines and the keg pump that we'd actually bring out. Okay, and was the early days that I was part of. They were established in dominating. What changed was Bill Gates and I actually retired on the same day. And I always said once Bill found out that I was leaving, he's like, I can't do this anymore. It's not true. Okay, but it does make my ego feel pretty good. But what I realized is that the culture had changed. It went from we value the input in the thoughts of our employees to no, just check boxes. And I realized, and that's when Ballmer came in, and it was like process. And what I realized is that we need to have a balance. It's not an either or. It's a yes and. And so I realized that the culture was going in a direction I didn't want. And so I could financially afford to walk away and said, it's time for me to go another direction before I actually despise being here. And so I made that wise decision to step away and actually raise my son and be the primary before that was something that was popular to do. Then the economic collapse happened. But I would say that's really a strong asset of Satya, is that he understands that we need processes, but once we master the science, we need to also bring in the art, right? It's not an either or. And he understands, yes, we need to make a profit, but we also need to care for our people, and we also need to care for our ecology in the environment as well. And he looks at it and says, how can we do both? And so it's about how do we integrate rather than how do we compete?
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, where do you see it? I mean, you've already talked about the sort of office landscape being transformed and kind of, I mean, how do you see organizations operating and people being effective leaders now suddenly, like people were reading all the time in the newspaper, like I think it was Twitter the other day basically said all our employees can work from wherever they are in the world as long as they get the job done, kind of thing.
Yeah, and so why weren't they doing that before? Fear, right? They were afraid that people aren't going to be productive, and we can look at stat after stat, and the reason for that is that they have no sense of stability. And so what they have learned that they need to do is they're like, well, we need to maintain success, and if we just put people into an environment where they're not being monitored or controlled, although they wouldn't say that, is now what's the difference in the landscape? Well, we're making a global issue out of, okay, everybody's at home. How do we create a stable environment for our employees at home? What are the resources? What is the education? What are the things, the tools that they need to have stability so that they can be successful? And so we can look at that and really kind of take a step back and say, you know, you can train people, but if you don't actually trust that they can do it, you're wasting your time and your effort. And so what I would say is shifting at this point is that people have no choice. They got to have these people working from remote. So they asked a better question. How do we set them up for success by giving them stability? Because here's the reality. For people that actually work at home, study after study after study shows that they get way more productivity out of that employee than they do actually in a brick and mortar. Because what happens? Well, 5 o'clock rolls around, and if you're at a brick and mortar, you probably just go home, or we can think in old days, you didn't take your work home, right? Well, if you're at home, you're eating dinner, and you hear ding, I just need to go check this one email. It was really important. I've been waiting on this deal. It'll only take me 15 minutes. Well, how many of those 15 minutes keep adding up? Guess what? You're not working 40 hours a day. They got you round the clock. First thing you do, wake up, boom, 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 doing that. They got you working nonstop. And so that stability is our responsibility to say, where do I need to put in some pit stops? If we look at sports analogy, we look at Formula One as an example, race car driving. You can have the best driver in the world. You can have the most advanced technology and vehicle in the world, and you can have the best pit crew in the world. You will never, ever win a Formula One race without taking a pit stop. Can't do it. But you have to scientifically know when do you strategically take that pit stop, right? And what are the resources that need to be refreshed? New tires, how much gas, whatever, right? They know exactly because the environment, what the temperatures are, etc. Football, they have intermissions, right? So every sport has that. Nature has that. Seasons have that. We need to have that for our employees as well. And so they're asking better questions, and those are the companies that are going to win that are asking those better questions. How do we set them up for success? By creating stability in their work environment.
No, really interesting. So what we've been ideating at Novum is very much looking at like profiling teams basically and using data scientists to go like, how do you figure out what a winning team is? And it's always been fairly conceptual, but like the idea is sort of like, it's kind of weird because every successful business in some ways is slightly different, but in tech the nice thing is like you need really strong business people, you need really strong tech people, and then you need that sort of winning culture and dynamic, and it's interesting. Like, what variables do you think we should be tracking, kind of thing, if
Well,
we
I think that those are, yeah, I think that those are essential, and what you've raised are certainly good key performance indicators that you want to take a look at. In addition to that, right now, we have a really unique opportunity to look back in time. And by looking back in time, you could look back at what are some of the companies that actually launched successfully during recessions or depressions. Well, you've got Walt Disney. They've done all right for themselves. You've got Hewlett Packard, Microsoft, actually back in 81, 82, FedEx, Trader Joe's, Burger King, Stripe, all kinds of EA for so if we look back and say, who are the companies that had the audacity and the vision to succeed when times were tough? That's a company that says, we need to be resourceful. We need to be adaptive. We need to say, what are the ingredients and how do we package it up and how do we continue until we find how we can dominate? The second thing in that, right, is so that's resourcefulness is one of those things that you can look for. And that's about character of who's at the helm. That's about character of who's in the company. And you want to look for how resourceful they are. The second in that is, are they in to compete or are they in to dominate? And I had this conversation recently. Somebody's like, well, dominate's a little harsh. That's a little forceful. And I said, depends on which definition you're looking at. The second actual, and it literally in the Oxford Dictionary is the second definition term for dominate, is that, like abrasive and bullying people kind of thing. But the first is how I would really kind of look at, if you're playing football, if you're competing, you're paying attention to the defensive line that you're trying to score against. That's competition. If I'm dominating, Toby, all I see is a goal. I don't look at the competition. My focus, all my attention is on score, score, score. I don't concern myself with the competition. I am dominating because the goal is to actually score, not compete. Those are the companies that I'm looking for, the people that are able to ethically dominate.
Yeah, no, and actually that really reminds me of, I've been reading the Uber book. So it's basically this tale of the sort of rise and turbulence of Uber. And it's really fascinating because they had the will to win like probably no other chief executive ever, like in terms of his sort of just insistence of winning. But he was also very ethically challenged in terms of like his mindset, in that he sort of basically was like, well, we're going to win by whatever means possible, was pretty much and that was what he almost like instilled culturally in everywhere, and had all the different sort of officers competing against each other, going, who can win market share? I don't care how it's done, but just win me market share. And it was a really intriguing case study because they did so many things right, but then kind of ended up with a kind of corrosive culture because they also didn't know how to sort of manage that.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of factors of some things that they did well and some things that they were challenged by. And I'll use the analogy of Russia versus the United States or the British culture. And we know about the Cold War and the clash and the difference in perspective, right? But what a lot of Western Hemisphere people don't understand is that Americans and British want to know the rules so that we can stay within the lines, right? It's like, okay, color in this, and we need to know where the lines and the boundaries are so that we can stay within that and draw a nice, pretty picture, okay? The Russians, they want to know where the loopholes are, the open spots, so that they can actually stay within the legal requirements. They're not breaking the law. So it's kind of like, look, if Parliament says, hey, here's some tax loopholes for you to take advantage of, the Russians are like, show me where the loopholes are. You made them, don't blame me for taking advantage of them. If you don't want me to do it, close the loopholes, right? The British are kind of like, oh, I know that they're there, but that would be improper for me to actually take advantage of those. It's just a difference in culture. And personally, I like the Russian culture of, look, are you willing to take the risk of getting an audit and having to defend that what you did was still legal and still ethical? So it becomes a question of ethics is what it comes down to. And the company I want to bet on is the one that's got the audacity to say, you created the loopholes, don't blame me. They're still ethical, but they're audacious to say, take advantage of them.
And that was what was brilliant about the company, was that they really did upturn a market that most people were pretty unhappy with. So it's kind of
Yeah,
But
similar to Blockbuster and Netflix, right?
yeah,
Blockbuster could have bought Netflix, but they went, we don't, why do we need to do that? We're comfortable. Why would anybody not want to get in the car, drive all the way to the store to see whether the movie's in or out? Ah, crap, I drove all this way and they don't have any stock. Versus click, instant gratification. They never saw it coming.
yeah, which is
What
crazy.
Uber's doing is taking advantage of what their competition never saw coming. So they didn't look at competing. Look at them. They're not competing. They're trying to dominate.
And that's so much what like our kind of vision at Novum is very, very much like it's almost predictable. Like the
Oh
blockbuster
yeah.
Netflix one, it was just screaming that this was going to happen. Everyone
Yeah.
in tech and Silicon Valley pretty much had calculated if it wasn't Netflix, it would be someone else. But at the same time, like it was. You read the story of Netflix, he was doing it for ages and just mailing out videotapes, and they probably just thought, oh, this is just some mail order company. Why do we need to care about it? And even when the stock market was sort of re-rating them, they were pretty much of that attitude.
Yeah.
Um,
And that's what you want to look for, right? Is the people that can actually see and forecast the weather accurately. 2008, 2009, I retired in 2007 knowing full well that the storm of all storms was coming. I knew it was coming. I knew that there was a massive recession about to hit. And so I had to say, do I have enough stability to weather the storm? The same thing with this pandemic that hit. As I looked at it and went, Toby, you don't have to be a genius to see that we've had 11 years of a bull market when typically 2 out of 10 years you have a downturn, you have a bear market. Who knows which 2 it's going to be, but we've been 11 years. The storm's coming. So guess what? I just wait for that storm to just rocket. Went from 29,000 in the market in the US to 19. And guess what? I knew it was coming. So I took all that cash at 19 and went, put it into play now. So if you know what to look for, signs can be pretty obvious.
yeah, read the signals. But anyway, so I think it's been a really, really great chat, Chad. So thanks for sharing lots of different pearls of wisdom, and I really enjoyed it.
My
Is there
pleasure.
anything more you want to add, or
No, I would say, any questions, feel free for people to reach out to you, forward them over, and I'm happy to have any other questions. If anybody wanted to reach out directly, they can simply email me at coachcooper@chadecooper.com. E is in Edward. That's not quite, well, I guess Edward's British, isn't it? But Eaton's more British, so E's in Eaton. So Coach Cooper at chadecooper.com, and happy to support your audience any way that I can.
Okay, thanks, Chad.
You got it. Cheers.
Bye.